Guys, it's awesome to see everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you all had a nice, safe holiday weekend. Today, I'm going to focus on two kind of really, really large topics. The first is competitive analysis. How do you figure out who else is in your market competing with you? And how do you take kind of a broad lens of what it means to be a competitor? And then we're going to dig a little into crafting what's called a unique value proposition, often goes by the acronym UVP, which is how do you communicate what makes your business or nonprofit different, unique, distinctive from that competitive set. So when I think about competition, I'm often reminded of this wonderful book that Chris Anderson wrote, I think it was in 2008, maybe a little earlier, called The Long Tail. And this was right kind of during a huge boom in e-commerce. And he had this theory that with the prevalence of e-commerce, there was going to be this increased access to nearly unlimited array of vendors and customers for all sorts of niche products and services. And this is the graph that he draws, right? That you have these hits, these huge popular products and services that get a lot of attention, but then there's this long tail, as he referred to it, for niche commerce and content. Now, he was applying it to online supply and demand, but I think it's just as applicable today to entrepreneurial opportunity and to competition. So what you're seeing in the world today is there's this much broader access to customers if you know what to look for and you know how to target them. And I know that's a topic that you're going to address later in the Kinetic Creators program. And that's why the work that you guys did last week around who your target customer is and segmenting the market and being laser focused on that key demographic is so, so vitally important and valuable. But this also means, with great opportunity, that there's much broader competition for those in those markets, right? So there are lower and lower barriers to entry in many industries to break in, and there's a lot more competition, a lot more people trying to take advantage of that. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on that question of competitors. And this is a lot of content to cover. I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. I've got kind of a live case study that we'll dive into a little later. I tried to select a lot of case studies, many of which I'm drawing directly from the creators that I've had a chance to work with. And I even asked a few people to share their initial competitive analysis in advance. So hopefully it's not just me talking at you the whole time, even that's sort of the nature of Zoom. But to summarize what we're going to focus on today, there are kind of four key topics. The first is, who is your competition? And what are the key factors that make your business distinctive from that competition, right? So we're going to help you identify your competitive set. We're going to talk through how to analyze them, how to differentiate from them, and then how to communicate that differentiation, which is, again, known as your UVP, or your unique value proposition, to customers, to partners, and to investors. So that's what we're going to cover today. And let's begin by doing a little bit of a share out. So to kick things off, Jess suggested 3 teams. I know that Rachel, I don't think is on this call, but is there any chance that either John P., the team behind Live Connected, or Reedy, Diversometer, is on the call? Okay, that's okay. I'll take that as a no. Is there anyone on the call who wants to take a shot at answering this seemingly very simple question or questions? Namely, who is your competition and what key information do you know about them?
And I'm happy to cold call on people too.
I can share.
Great.
Oh,
Hi.
perfect, Priya. I was going to cold call on you.
Hi, Edward. I'm Priya.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Could you also, just for my own information, tell me a little bit about the business that you're developing?
Yeah, so I'm developing more of a platform for young students in Mauritius, where I'm from. So basically, I found out during COVID-19, I wanted to set a platform to pair secondary school students with online tutors who would mostly be university students. But I found that they don't really need that. What they need is mentoring, because at the end of secondary school in Mauritius, there is no counselor or anyone to help you with applying for universities or decide what career you want to go into.
Mhm.
So what I'm doing right now is I've started with a series of group Zoom sessions, and I invite people studying in different countries. I've done USA, I've done UK. This week I'm doing Canada. So these university students, they come on Zoom and they explain how to apply to these universities, and they share the experiences, and the students get a chance to ask questions. So as I was saying, there's really not much at the end of high school. So I don't really have a lot of competition, but I do have like two companies that I can think of. So there's this one consulting company in Mauritius called Phronesis, and they help you with your US university applications, but they do charge you a lot, like a lot of money, whereas our service is free.
Mhm. Phronesis, okay, got it. And
Yeah.
was there one other?
Yeah, there's another one called Study USA, and they are kind of newer, but they also charge a lot.
Got it. So one of the ways that you're planning to differentiate is in the market that you're targeting, whereas these companies like Phronesis and Study USA are probably looking at higher end income families that are able to devote those monetary resources to give those opportunities to their kids. You're trying to democratize, access to that information and access to universities. That's really
Right, yeah.
wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. That's great. Is there anyone else on the call that wants to give a shot at kind of an initial walkthrough of who their competitors are?
I can probably talk about our idea. Hi, I'm Aida. So we're still like not sure what we're going to be doing, but we have like an entrepreneurship platform basically, and we're trying to have like early stage startups so that you get like an entrepreneurs, developers, mentors, and investors kind of together, and then they can just like share their idea, they can vote on the idea, and just like get connected basically, based on certain like skill sets, and like in terms of our competitors, I think we've looked into like what we call like history of similar products, and we found that there's like startups.com, and people have been like doing a lot of for example, like they've already had people pose their idea and vote on it, but I think it's more of not like a social network platform, but more of like where people can vote on your idea, so it's very specific towards one thing. And then we've also found other websites that have been more into like geared towards education or towards just like pure mentorship, but we want to kind of like connect all of it together. And
I'm sorry, Aida, I think you cut out.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry. You
Sorry.
said yeah, you were gearing more towards bringing it all together.
Yeah, and just like so that someone like on your mind, basically, like people, like you would know which one, like which platform you're using, like the most popular, I guess.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, two very, very cool ideas, especially for someone who is kind of living in this intersection of entrepreneurship and education, which is where I operate. And thank you so much for stepping up and sharing. I really appreciate both of you. So yeah, I mean, I think you're on the right track, right? Obviously, when we start out by asking this question of who is our competitor set, we think about, well, what makes a competitor? And traditionally, you would define a competitor, as you're doing a business analysis, as someone who operates in the same industry or a similar industry and offers a similar product or service, right? So, with Priya, she initially is looking at Phronesis and Study USA, which are these two platforms that help students research and get into college. And for Aida, it's startups.com, and that makes a lot of sense. But the next step, the next layer down of a competitive analysis, especially important when you're in the early stages of building a startup, is to consider your competitors to be any alternative solution that can be used by your target customer to address the problem that you're seeking to solve, right? So in other words, a competitor means that you have to reorient yourself. Competition isn't just the other companies that do exactly what you do. In fact, it's better to define it, let your customer define it, right? So your competitive set is, let's say for this Prius platform for young students, it's what else are students and their families doing? Could be online, could be offline, as they are beginning to explore secondary education options in that part of the world, right? And for AIDA, it's even broader, right? I mean, the plethora of options for people that are starting a company to get more info, find mentors, find funding. I mean, you could even start with the Small Business Association in a given city, right? So it's vitally important when you do your competitive research to broaden the definition. And the way that we do that is in two buckets. We have direct competitors, which are the companies that sell the same or similar products to your target customer. But then there are also indirect competitors, firms that sell different products but compete for the same customers, okay? Direct and indirect competitors. So I'd like to use a simple example. We'll use quick service restaurants. And I'll come back to this a couple of times because my management consulting experience, a lot of it was in developing fast food. So apologies if I keep coming back to McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's, but it's pretty simple, right? So for McDonald's, let's say you were conducting a competitive analysis. Initially, you'd say, okay, Burger King, Wendy's, and the other kind of quick service restaurants that focus on speed, efficiency, and not necessarily on health. But then indirect competitors would be other companies that solve that same need, which is I need to get food quickly that is good tasting, right? So you'd include Pizza Hut in that competitive set. You'd include Starbucks. You'd include the local sandwich shop around the corner from, you know, a family that isn't a national brand but fulfills the same need. You'd even include options at home, right? Like what is McDonald's going to do to prompt people not to wait until they get home or wait till they get to the office and microwave their food, but instead draw them to eat at their restaurant. So there are both direct and indirect competitors. If you're a bike company, your direct competitor, you know, to Trek would be companies like Schwinn or Giant. But your indirect competitors would be what? What are some examples of indirect competitors in the world of bikes, do you guys think? Anybody can jump in and tell me.
Razor scooters.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Razor scooters, Segway, these automated skateboards, right? So you need to look broadly at your competitive set if you're starting a bike company, and maybe the market position that you take is, okay, we're not transportation for anyone, we're transportation plus fitness, right? So it's important to begin to broaden this perception of who makes up your competitive set. Let's take an example direct from the creators. So I'm going to use Patching In. This is one of the test track teams that I've had the privilege of working with this summer. So this is Julia, Karen, Tyler, and Michael. What they're doing is they're developing a small patch that monitors the sweat of post-surgical patients in order to provide early indication of sepsis, which is one of the leading problems that leads to people readmitting to the hospital. And their goal is to cut back on the astronomical costs, both in terms of dollars spent and in terms of lives lost, that come with hospital readmissions. So if they were doing their competitive analysis, of course, they probably start with other sweat monitoring patches that are low cost and provide and track biomarkers that can indicate if there's a problem, right? And that would make sense. And there are probably a handful of them on the market. But then from there, they'd want to get more broad. What are the other solutions that hospitals, patients, healthcare providers, insurance providers are turning to cut down on this huge global problem of readmissions to hospital? There are devices that are implanted during surgery that live in the human body. I put the CardioMEMS here under indirect competitors. Now that measures pulmonary artery pressure, but still, you can imagine things in the body, right? You could look at wearables, right? Consumer direct wearables like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit that monitor blood pressure. You know, doctors send people home with blood pressure monitors, even things like tracking weight, right? These could be lower cost solutions that may have less efficiency, but still should be considered in the patching in competitive set, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is your competitors are far broader than just those companies that are doing exactly what you're doing, right? You need to orient yourself to your customer, think about what they're using to solve the problem. You might want to even turn back to the work you did last week, right? So you might, I just pulled this slide directly from Professor Shanis's wonderful presentation from last week, right? You have this customer profile or profiles that you're putting together. And one excellent way to identify both direct and indirect competitors would be to ask your customer directly, right? So in your interviews with them or your surveys, you could ask them which brands they've heard of from the people that you consider competitors. What's your impression of those brands? How do you currently solve this particular problem, right? It would be a good way to get an indirect competition. Okay, so orient yourself to your customer, their mindset, and the solutions they're seeking out, and don't limit yourself to just the companies that are doing the exact thing that you're doing. Think about both indirect and direct competitors. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions before I move on? Great, it's pretty straightforward. The final category that I always encourage early stage entrepreneurs to look at when they're doing this competitive analysis is what we call inspirers, right? So these are the products and services in different industries that could transform your industry. It could be things like incredible design, innovative customer service, the early adoption of certain technologies or tools that haven't yet hit the industry that you're focused on. But it's really powerful to broaden your perspective as you conduct this research. An author I love, Sonia Thompson, says that limiting your source for inspiration also limits the range of your ideas. One of the things that always frustrated me when I was in consulting was you would do work for these stagnant industries, like let's go back to healthcare for a second. And you'd come to them with early stage recommendations that draw from other industries, right? And best practices, whether it's in healthcare, usually it had to do with customer service. And they would always push back and say, well, that doesn't apply to us because that's not in our industry. We want you to come with information about direct competitors to us, right? And that inherently leads to the stagnation of innovation, right? You want to broaden that perspective. So some examples that I really love, these are a couple. This is Sprinkles Bakery in Manhattan, and they were able to innovate on their distribution model by looking at the banking industry, right? So they decided to create this 24-hour cupcake ATM machine that sat outside of their bakery. And it was a simple idea that was the norm in banking and then enhanced the customer experience when used in baking. 3M, one of the most innovative companies in the world, is great at this. They do all sorts of panels and conduct research that focuses on how can they draw inspiration from other industries. So one example is that they developed this breakthrough concept for preventing infections after surgery by getting input from a theatrical makeup specialist who was knowledgeable about preventing facial skin infections, right? So an example of kind of broadening that scope of the industries you're looking at and the folks you're talking to. Another great example is in the automobile industry. So anti-lock brakes actually were originally developed for aircraft carriers and high-speed jets to help them brake on the carriers. So let's say you were trying to develop a new braking system, you would look at industries, groups that need better brakes, like auto racing teams or aerospace. This is an example of what's called lead user adoption. So you look at industries that may begin tinkering and playing with technology before your industry, and you try to incorporate and bring it across the fold. So the message here is to, wherever possible, and I wouldn't just say this is for competitive analysis, it's really for everything you guys are doing, would be to broaden your perspective. A wonderful professor at Penn, Adam Grant, who's an expert on original thinking, in his book, Originals, he encourages entrepreneurs and creators to think in flexible ways and try to find connections or sources of inspiration in unexpected places. And you see this throughout history, right? Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, didn't invent the assembly line. What he did was, by observing the meatpacking industry, he realized that he could bring that innovation into a different industry and became the most successful automotive maker ever, right? Einstein's theory of relativity was actually based on musical theory, because he was forced to play violin his whole life growing up and he hated it, but then it led to one of his most wonderful breakthroughs. The way that Galileo was able to spot mountains on the moon was actually because he was trained in a drawing technique that involved shading, right? And the black, white, and gray to indicate elevation in drawing was how he observed that on the moon. So you certainly want to look at your competitors. You certainly want to look at your indirect and direct competitors, but you also want to broaden your perspective and try to find inspiration from other industries. So how do you do this? Well, the first step would be to build what we call an inspiration list. So you journal, right? As you see and experience examples of remarkable customer experiences and action, start writing them down and take notes of features that bring joy, begin to kind of categorize those things. And then the second step, and I believe you guys started doing this last week, is to map out the entirety of your customer's journey, right? You want a list of every stage of their experience in your industry, and you could look for specific pain points that could be improved upon by adopting things that have worked in other industries. But the bottom line is that you want to shift the possibilities you're looking at. You want to get out of your comfort zone, and you want to keep in mind that there's no need to reinvent the wheel all the time. Great innovation can come by taking ideas from other industries and then applying elements of that to your own business. Okay? So to recap, when it comes to competitive analysis, you've got your direct competitors, you've got your indirect competitors, you've got your inspirers. Those are the three kind of buckets of analysis that you want to engage in order to do this the right way. Okay? Then the last point I want to make before we move on from competition is a quick word on first mover status. Does anybody know what this term means, first mover status? You can probably guess from the context.
Like the first person or business to enter the market.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Priya. So, a lot of times, this is more of a problem for my high school kids probably than for you guys, but they come into my program and they say, we've got this novel, innovative idea and no one's ever thought of it before, and there are no competitors in the space. And they spend 15 minutes Googling, and given, because of the long tail, right? More often than not, there are indirect and direct competitors. And they throw up their hands and they say, oh my God, well, we got to scrap this. That's not always true, right? First mover advantage sometimes holds true, but not always. And a lot of it depends on the circumstances. So I'm going to send you guys a wonderful article from Harvard Business Review that kind of runs through how to think about first mover advantage when inevitably you guys stumble across a company that's doing exactly what you're doing, and how to make strategic decisions based on that research, okay? So Vanessa, I guess I'll forward that along to you and you can throw it out there, okay?
Yeah.
All right, so that's the competition. After you've collected all your competition, the next step is to conduct analysis, okay? So there's a wide variety of competitive analysis frameworks, right? Models that can help shape how you go about analyzing your competitors and what questions to orient your research around. But for the purposes of an early stage entrepreneur, I think there are two that are particularly useful. The first is Michael Porter's 5 forces, and that's kind of like, I would say, the first step to analyze the competitive structure of your entire industry. And then the second is what's called perceptual mapping, which is a way to understand how your customers perceive your product offering in relation to all your other competitors. All right, so let's start with 5 forces. According to Michael Porter, there are 5 key forces that affect how much competition a business in any given industry faces, okay? And I'll run through them one at a time. The first, and you see it in the, with that rocket ship, is the threat of new entrants. So that's basically how easy is it for a new business to set up shop and begin. The second is bargaining power of suppliers. So how much power do the suppliers in your industry have? The third is the bargaining power of customers. This is also sometimes known as like switching costs. How much power do customers have? How easy is it for them to jump from different vendors and have a variety of options? The third is competitive rivalry. How many markets compete? I'm sorry, how many firms or businesses compete? And how much is the market growing or shrinking? Then the final is the threat of substitutes. How likely are customers to switch to an alternative offering? This is where your research around indirect competitors really, really matters, okay? So 5 forces. Let's put somebody on the spot. We'll pick one of the biggest and most popular companies in the world, Uber. Who wants to take a shot at running through the 5 forces for Uber? And we can kind of talk it out as a team.
So distributor partner, I think, is Eden Park. And I think you talked to these folks as well.
It's a quiet group. Eric, why don't you take a shot?
Okay. So Uber's main competitor, if I'm not mistaken, is Lyft. And I heard some other people talking about this like just a week ago, some tech VC people, and they said one of Uber's biggest moats, protecting them from other competitors, is the fact that they have in the two-sided supply chain a very large driving force as well as a very large customer base, which means that they have just very hard for any other competitors to kind of gather both those things and to enter the market. And I guess that means that they minimize the threat of new entrants and threat of substitutes. So I guess that's 2 of the forces.
Well said. I absolutely agree with you in terms of threat of substitutes. I mean, clearly there are a lot of transportation options, right? But Uber has a pretty unique value proposition in terms of the ease and, at least as of now, the affordability of what they're doing, right? And in terms of new entrants, I agree with you that although the technology is not a barrier to entry, right? Because there's nothing proprietary about what Uber does. It's kind of just an on-demand connecting a driver with a person that needs a ride. The scale that they've been able to achieve is, as you so rightly put it, a moat. What about some of these other things? Bargaining power of suppliers, bargaining power of customers. Anybody want to add? I'm sorry, who was that just spoke up a second ago?
I'm actually fine. Yeah, circulating beforehand, right? So
It was me, Eric.
Oh, Eric, hey, thank you so much. Is there
All right,
anyone else that wants to add on to what Eric's points about Uber? There is someone talking. Someone's saying something. I don't know if they're talking to us.
I can try and take a crack at this.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
I think when it comes to bargaining power of customers, since it's so individual and you just get a new Uber driver, a different Uber driver every time, you don't really have that much bargaining power as a customer because it feels, which I guess puts Uber in a better position because it's not like if Uber raises the prices, the customers like collectively can get together easily and say like, we want the prices to be lower.
Can the customers switch to an alternative?
I suppose so, but then there's also the thing of, I think because they entered the market relatively early, whenever someone thinks of a drive share program or talks about using a drive share program, it's always like, I'm going to catch an Uber or I'm going to get an Uber rather than like, I'm going to get a Lyft. Yeah. The Kleenex example, right? It's become a noun, yeah. Okay, wonderful, good. Okay, and what about the bargaining power of the suppliers? Who are the suppliers in this scenario? I guess you could make in my opinion, it would be the people who are being the Uber drivers.
Yeah,
they're
absolutely
supplying the actual cars. And I think it's been in the news a couple of times where some Uber drivers have complained about their lack of, I guess, especially in the pandemic, the lack of protection provided by Uber. But I feel since this is also, it's kind of that ride share kind of program, their bargaining power is also reduced because they're the ones that choose to take up this job in the first place, and they're the one providing most of the costs. So think Uber is just like, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? They're not mandated to continue to work for them, but there also are alternatives, right? A lot of people you may see when they're drivers, they have both a Lyft and an Uber sticker in their window, right? And they can swap back and forth depending on what rates are working, et cetera, et cetera. What wonderful job, guys. Yeah, I think you covered most of the analysis that I would do for this. This is kind of my crack at it, and I'll start with threat of new entrants. So as we discussed on the surface, I'd say for Uber, the threat of new entrants, you might say, is high because anyone can set up a ride sharing app. But again, there's nothing proprietary about the technology, but scale really, really matters in this industry. And that's why Uber has spent billions and billions of dollars losing money, right, to basically generate customer demand by offsetting the cost of rides, right? There's a lot of data that shows that for every ride, Uber actually spends $1 rather than makes $1, because they know that eventually someone's going to win this industry, right? And there's going to be one overarching global provider for this sort of service, and they're willing to outspend to get there. Next, I'll do bargaining power of suppliers. So this is an interesting one. I think it's somewhat weak because Uber has done a lot of work to block unionization and to categorize their drivers as freelance operators and not employees, much to the chagrin of many drivers and to the chagrin of, civil rights attorneys in some cases. But it's also important to keep in mind that switching costs for suppliers is really low, right? So there's nothing beholding them to Uber. There's no real loyalty there. It's all about who can pay them and where the riders are. Bargaining power of customers, I think it's kind of high. I mean, there is strong ride-sharing competition. I mean, even though Uber, I agree, is the biggest brand, there are also alternative means of transportation. I think competitive rivalry is pretty high, especially internationally, right? Ola in India is kind of the big winner. Vanessa, is there a Didi? Is that the one in China?
Yeah, Didi's one China.
Yeah. And then there's
Means
Lyft.
little brother.
Oh, great. Yeah. So there is a lot of competition, even though Uber's the winner. I think the threat of substitutes is low, and this is the sort of analysis that you'd want to do I would argue, before you even worry about identifying your list of competitors. You got to kind of look at the industry as a whole and begin to do this. And then once you do that, the next useful tool that I like to recommend that early stage startups use is what's called a perceptual map. So a perceptual map is just a visual representation of your product relative to the other competing alternatives in the market. And it's mapped against usually two different criteria that you select. So the first step when you build a perceptual map is to determine the two attributes that you want to use as a basis for comparison. Often you'll see things like quality and price. And then you plot where your product falls and where your competitors fall on the spectrum of those two attributes. So this is just one example, but if I were to build it for going back to quick service restaurants, here's an example of a competitive analysis framework that maps perceptions of like the relative health of a food brand against the target age, right? So if you were trying to start a new quick service restaurant brand, you might map this and you might see, oh, look, there's opportunity in this upper left-hand quadrant, kind of like junk food, but targeted towards adults. And then you might find yourself as Shake Shack, right? So in the early 2000s, it was kind of this market insight that led to the meteoric rise of a brand like Shake Shack, which is, IPO'd since and is now one of the fastest growing food chains in the world. And you can do this across a lot of different attributes, right? So you could also do a perceptual map for quick service restaurants based on value and occasion, right? But for your purposes, I would say that for this upcoming week, you want to kind of pick the two attributes that you think are most important for your work and begin to map your competitors accordingly. This is also a wonderful way to visually show your competitors in say your final presentation. But I really want to say that, again, this type of analysis is traditionally defined by conversations with your customers. So for your initial research purposes, you could base this just on your own observations and your own research, but in future surveys or conversations with your customers or industry stakeholders, you really want to begin to ask questions like, what tools or technology or products do you currently use to address this problem? What brands are you aware of? And begin to dig into what their perception of those brands are, because it'll really help you with where you lie in terms of the market. Okay, so far we've talked about what makes up a competitive set, and we've talked about how to begin to conduct this research and analysis as you build your business model. All right, so the third thing I want to talk about is methods of differentiation. So once you know your competitors, the next step is to figure out how to beat them. There are a variety of strategies that you can take, but I think there are 5 primary ones that you want to begin to look at as you build your unique value proposition. So the first is just the product, right? Can you have better features, better performance, more durability or reliability? Apple is a fabulous example of coming time and time again to, we make the best, most beautiful, best functioning products. And sure, their branding and their storytelling is great as well, but it really always comes back to the product. And as a result, they're able to charge a premium price. The second way you can compete is based on service, right? Is it easier to order from you? Better, installation or customer training? Do you deliver faster, right? That was part of Amazon's huge competitive differentiator. I think Geek Squad, what Best Buy was able to do here, whatever that was 20 years ago, is a wonderful example. They were trying to compete with Circuit City. So they said, okay, we're gonna have this team, we're gonna brand them in this unique and creative way, and we're actually gonna have them come out to your house and install your stuff as part of the service we provide. And that became almost as powerful and recognizable a brand as Best Buy itself. Third way you can compete is based on relationship, right? So whether that's credibility, you're great at communicating with customers, you're super responsive. State Farm is an awesome example of this, right? And you see this in all of their commercials. They're all about it. They don't talk about the affordability of their service. They talk about how when you're with State Farm, you have a relationship with someone you know and you trust that you can turn to in times of need. So building that relationship and having that be key to what you do is a third way to differentiate yourself from the competition. Fourth way is based on reputation and image, right? Think like Lego or Disney, great perception, great Q score, awesome PR and communication. And then a fifth way would be price, right? Are you the most affordable solution by customer, by market segment? Or potentially, are you the most premium luxury product on the market? But you can differentiate yourself by price. When it comes to startups, I kind of encourage you to focus on the top 3: product, service, relationship. I think reputation is great, but it takes time to build that. And price, I would just encourage you to be cautious. Don't just roll into a pitch and say, we're the most affordable option on the market, unless you can point to some sort of really innovative approach that you take in order to achieve that affordability. And keep in mind Vanessa's 5-to-1 ratio of pricing, basically that there are hidden costs associated with everything you're doing. And the last thing you want to do is draw a line in the sand and have your margins be really, really thin at the outset of your business, and then have a sneak attack where you realize that there are all sorts of hidden costs. So if you're going to compete on price, make sure you've got some sort of incredible innovation that you can point to say, here's how we're doing it, and still making a reasonable margin on every item we sell. All right, so those are the 5. 2 other things I keep in mind in this new world of ours. The first is, again, coming back to the customer, quality is defined by the customer. A product isn't quality because it's hard to make and costs a lot of money to make. Customers pay only for what is of use to them and what gives them value. Nothing else constitutes quality. So you really have to make sure that you're serving your customers' need and that they see the quality in what you're doing. And then the second thing I'd point out is that privacy is becoming more and more of a growing concern for buyers everywhere. So that could be an interesting little lever to pull as you're trying to think about what is going to differentiate you. I don't know if the LifeSpeak team is on the call right now, but that could be a good strategy for them. They're in my pod. You might see these billboards everywhere nowadays for DuckDuckGo, which is an alternative to Google that doesn't track anything you're doing, at least so they claim, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind, okay? All right, and then finally, so we've talked about who's the competition, how to analyze them, how to differentiate yourself, and then you have to bring it all together in what's called a unique value proposition. So a UVP is basically a statement that outlines why your solution is better than the competitors at meeting your customer's need. There's a typical structure for this. It looks like what I have on the slide. It's a statement that's like, for this particular customer who has this particular need, our product is a whatever that has this one key benefit. And unlike competitors such as X, Y, and Z, the product is better at these handful of things. Now, you'd never like read this statement outright, but if you nail down these 7 ingredients, you'll have the beginning of something compelling. And you'll also, I might add, have a nice outline for an investor pitch. So I asked Jack and Steven to take a crack at this for their business, Cloud Cars. One of you guys want to pop on and just read what we have up on the slide?
Yeah, sure, I can read it.
Thank you, Jack.
So for driverless mobility as a service providers who must clean their cars when trash is left behind, Cloud Cars provides a deep learning cloud model for the classification of passenger waste and images and a network of local cleaning partners so that no passenger ever gets into a dirty driverless car.
Wonderful. I appreciate you taking a shot at that. We don't have competition spelled out, but that's probably because it's hard to find competition in this particular nascent industry, right? Now, you know, when you pitch it, you may turn to indirect competitors, right? Here are all the solutions that cars might go through when they become driverless to clean up, right? This is a more convenient approach. Now, again, it's a mouthful, right? And I imagine given the complexity of many of your businesses, it's going to be hard to have one kind of run-on sentence. So once you have these ingredients nailed down, you need to think about telling a story, right? And I often recommend checking out the work of Nancy Duarte. The key to any sort of pitch or proposal or unique value proposition is that you need to balance data and narrative. So this is a chart from Nancy Duarte, and it's taken from a wonderful white paper from Harvard Business Review called How to Give a Killer Presentation. And it explains that most presentations lie somewhere on this continuum between a report and a story. A report is a data-rich, informative, but not very engaging thing. And stories help the speaker connect to the audience. So the key to coming up with this unique value proposition, and indeed the key to any sort of communication as an entrepreneur, is to layer these two elements together anytime you're presenting about your work. So here are a couple tips and tricks how to do that. You know, ask questions, tell stories, or give examples of when you've experienced the problem, especially if it's a problem that matters deeply to you. Jessica Stokes is a wizard at creating these sorts of narratives. So if you're struggling with how to convey a UVP in a compelling kind of narrative story way, you should seek her out. But here are a couple that I really love, industry examples. This first one is Simple. So this is a bank that was founded in 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis. And they sought to compete with Bank of America that had all these branches, but were very, very slow to create easy to use mobile apps. They eliminated branches. They focused on a great mobile app, great customer service, and they focused on an entirely different market segment, right? Younger, more tech savvy customers. And they created what could arguably be called the first 21st century bank. Now, there have been a lot of competitors that have entered this space since 2009, but at the time, the notion of shifting the target customer and delivering simplicity in the banking space was really revolutionary. And this is an example of competing on both product differentiation and service differentiation. Another great UVP is Tesla, right? So 17 years ago, when they decided to break into the electric vehicle marketplace, they didn't want to compete directly with the Chevy Volt or Toyota hybrids. Instead, they went for this high-end luxury sports model. So they were focusing on differentiating based on their product and with time based on their reputation and their image. And as a result of kind of that unique positioning, this year they surpassed Toyota as the most valuable automaker in the world. Then a third example, I love Slack, right? So they do a fabulous job of setting themselves apart from the thousands of other messaging and productivity apps that are available. They focus on all 5 of those competitive criteria. Credibility, right? They point to world-renowned companies that use their tool. Reliability, ease of use, better product, better service, even price, right? Like, why go and buy Microsoft Office when you can have this free or very low cost tool that works better and makes your teams more productive? So you can see that none of these brands have a block of paragraph text at the top of their website that included those elements, but they get at them through their messaging, through their storytelling, and that's what you're going to have to do. Okay? So, man, we covered a lot. I just have one more thing I want to share before we go to questions, and that's my suggestion not to fear the pivot, right? So because you're in this test track phase, I know this is the theme of everything you're doing is that you're learning, and your idea might change dramatically from what it was in early June. But just keep in mind that there are companies that were far down the road and made dramatic shifts in what they were doing and experienced incredible success, right? For example, YouTube started as a video-based dating service. Their slogan was tune in and hook up, right? Like literally videotapes. And then they over time pivoted to online video sharing. Slack, originally, they were a video game company. And they began to see that customers were using the in-game messaging platform more than the actual game itself. So they eliminated the video game entirely and they became Slack. Yelp used to be direct to restaurant anonymous suggestions as a platform. And then they realized they would have more success if they opened it up to the broader population. And then Shopify, that was originally a snowboard equipment store, like an online snowboard equipment store called Snow Devil. And then they had so many people coming to them saying, how did you get started? How did you move online? How did you create your e-commerce platform? That they realized they could take what they had done for their own company and open it up to broader industry. So don't fear the pivot. And some of the best companies have grown out of figuring out that the problem they're trying to solve or the technology that they're building actually isn't the right thing, and making that shift. So with that, we've covered everything I wanted to cover. Why don't we open it up for any questions, comments, discussion?
But if you need 5 more micas, then if you need 5 more micas, that's what we need to hear, right? Like, so then, like, just bring some out.
I'll get it started, Ed. You talked about when you had the perceptual map, they should choose 2 dimensions to focus on. How do you choose what the 2 dimensions should be?
That's a great question, Vanessa. I think it's just, you start off with what are the key criteria that you're going to use to differentiate your business, right? Like maybe work off of those 5 that I gave you the suggestions on, and then from there begin to kind of modify and adapt so that you're figuring out the key things that the industry cares about. That's where I would start.
And so when you used your example of food, healthy versus junk food was like a clear kind of
Healthy
spectrum.
versus food, right, and affordability, right? Mm-hmm. Another thing is you can just look at the brand promises of the other competitors in your market, right? If every website is talking about ease of access and ease of use, you might want to talk about complexity versus ease of use as one of the spectrum, right? If every competitor is talking about the price that they set, you probably want to have price as one of the components. it should grow. I mean, it should grow pretty naturally out of your competitive analysis. And again, if you feel like overwhelmed, make a couple of them, you know, and show them to your mentors and see which ones kind of speaks the most clearly.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks for the great presentation, Ed. So my question is, you talked at the end about pivoting ideas and how a lot of successful companies have originally been founded on kind of more niche ideas that then pivoted to target a broader market. So my question is, how much, when we're starting our company ideas, or formulating our company ideas, should we be focusing on a niche kind of market that we can really flesh out and understand, and then think about pivoting down the line? Or should we be targeting the broader market to begin with?
Well, in those 4 examples, I would say that in some cases, the key isn't going broader, but going more niche. Even though I used the word niche video game in the Slack example, I think at the time, the video game industry was a way bigger and more competitive market than like internal messaging within a business. But in terms of whether to go broad or whether to go niche, I would say that for the purposes of an early stage startup, go niche. Try to be super hyper focused on a specific problem that a lot of people can relate to, and figure out what you're going to carve out in terms of your space in that market. And then if you need to, you can always broaden and expand from there. But the trap that I see a lot when people give pitches, like especially investor pitches, is at the end of their presentation, someone will throw out this question of like, well, have you considered this? Or you could go this broad, or you could go in this direction. And in response, they begin to kind of stumble and say, oh yeah, well, we've considered that, we've considered that. It's way more effective if you say, cool suggestion. Right now, we're hyper-focused on solving this one particular problem and knowing everything we can about it. And we're gonna learn and adapt from there. So I would make sure that you're laser focused is what I would say. And don't pivot until you've learned enough to make an informed pivot. Does that make sense, Eric?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Sure.
We have time for one last question. Who wants to ask it?
I can ask if that's okay.
Hi, Alexa.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Alexa. I don't think we've met. I'm on the fast track, but I thought that this presentation would be very useful because our team is kind of undergoing a pivot right now. So for some context, my team is working on a platform that was kind of brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic that would figure out an easier process of matching hospitals that need additional workers with the workers that are currently in the workforce.
Right.
So because of who I had access to and all that, I had looked in Philadelphia, was looking at Penn, and have just kind of realized that it's very difficult to like go in and change a system the way that it's already done. And if you're going to propose an idea, it better be better than the existing, like you had mentioned, indirect competitors that are already being used. So one option that we have kind of thought about is just completely switching the market that we go to, because we have several members that are actually in Amman, Jordan, and they don't have the indirect competitors that a sophisticated system like Penn does. So it's like just completely switching the market, that the customer base that we're even looking at, we're able to eliminate the competition. So to just even get started. So
Yeah, Alexa, that sounds smart. Shifting the market is always an interesting play, especially when you're dealing with an industry that has as much institutional inertia as a hospital system.
yeah,
Hospital system. I think that the healthcare industry as a whole is one of the most complex market ecosystems that you can dive into.
yeah.
But don't be intimidated, because with complexity means that there's a ton of opportunity for improving processes and mapping that customer journey and figuring out those kind of little niches that can lead to, billion-dollar companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Vanessa often shares this awesome example in some of her talks about, it's like CAT scan machines, right, Vanessa? where it wasn't the fidelity of the image, but instead it was how they load and unload the patient from the bed and kind of the usability of that tech platform, right?
Yeah.
So
I guess one question I had, sorry to interrupt, but
oh, go ahead, please.
your time is limited. But just one question I had was, when you're kind of switching markets and refocusing, does it make more sense to appeal on a broader scale, or to go in very specifically to like one specific hospital within this new market, and get more of a sense?
It's a great question. And since I'll just fall back on the name of the program, right? The test track. So I would always encourage you to operate lean and to do test cases and to focus on helping organizations or companies that you have a direct connection with, at least as an initial, benchmark of what you're trying to do. So I wouldn't worry about going too broad at first. If you have one connection in your partner's, home city or whatever, and you actually have access and you can get in there and even do long-term research and get embedded and observe and take notes, that's where you should start before you spend a lot of time, energy, and money exploring a broad market. From there, take what you learn and see if it's applicable. But even if you can get one hospital to sign up for something, inevitably being able to point back at that and say, look at the market results that we have from this one case study. It's changed patient outcomes by X, or whatever. That'll be way more powerful than having, a ton of secondary research that you can point to, but without any real traction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
No problem.